Hi everyone. In this lesson we want to talk about the imaginary number I. Now we know there's no real number that you could square to get a negative number like -4, so that means that the square root of -4 can't be a real number. But in the history of mathematics it became useful to invent, or maybe someone discovered, numbers that would make that possible. And so we use this letter I to denote the square root of -1, and I you can think of as standing for imaginary, and then I squared, if I were to square both sides of this, I squared would be equal to a -1. So I is the special number, an imaginary number if you want to call it that, such that you can square it and actually get a negative number. And you may want to think of it just as a nomenclature, another way of simplifying this a little further, so you can see where they might have had an advantage for this. Instead of thinking of the square root of -4, you could use your rules of simplification. You could write this as the square root of 4 times -1, and that would give you the square root of 4 times the square root of -1, and you could simplify that as 2i. And 2i certainly looks a little simpler than the square root of -4. So I could do the similar thing with the square root of -24. This would be the square root. I'd break up any perfect square factors like 4 and -1 and then 6. And I'll put those over on the left hand side of the radical, so I can write underneath it, take the square root of 4, which is 2, and the square root of the -1, which is I, and I'll be left with the square root of 6. And so I can simplify the square root of -24 as 2i square root of 6. So very basically, if you ever have a square root of a negative, you can just kind of think of grabbing that negative, and when you pull it out of the radical, it becomes an I. It's that simple. Alright, so if I had a negative square root of -63, notice that this negative is going to be a little different from this negative. This is going to give me a negative square root, and I'll break up 63 as 9 times 7, and then I'll put the -1 here. So I'm going to get -3, and then the square root of the -1 is an I, and I'll be left with the square root of 7. So notice this negative didn't cancel this negative. This negative came out as an I. So I got a negative I, and then the square root of 9 is 3, and I can simplify that way. Alright, now here's an interesting problem. Suppose I had the square root of -4 times the square root of -4. And if you think about it, there's actually two ways that I could simplify this. One way would be to go ahead and put those under the same radical. And notice that when I did that, that would give me the square root of 16, which is +4. Now another way I could do that is I could think of the square root of -4, like we did up here, as 2i. And if I multiplied 2i here by 2i here, notice that that would give me a 4 times an I squared. And I squared, remember, is -1. So this would be 4 times -1, which is -4. So the question is, which answer should it be? Should it be -4 or should it be +4? Well, if you think about it this way, if I think of this as the square root of -4 squared, I would like the square to undo the square root so that I just get what's under the radical, which is -4. So I really do want it to equal this one. And so I'm not going to allow myself to do it this way. In fact, this brings us to an extension of the order of operations for expressions that have square roots of negative numbers. And the rule is that you have to first express the square root of the negative in terms of I before you multiply. Alright, so I can't put these under the same radical and then multiply. First have to bring the I out and then multiply them. Alright, so if I had, for example, the square root of -20 times the square root of -5, I could just think of that as I times the square root of 20 times I square root of 5, and then the I times the I is I squared, and the square root of 20 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 100. I can put those under that radical. So this is going to give me a -1 times 10, or simply -10. And notice that would have been different if I would have not brought the I out, right? If I just put them under the same radical, I'd get the square root of a positive 100, which is positive 10, and that wouldn't be the correct answer. This is the correct answer. Same thing here. I'd write this as I square roots of 3 times I square roots of 6, which is I squared times the square root of 18. So change your I squared. That equals a negative 1. And then you can write 18 as 9 times 2. So I get negative 3 square roots of 2. And that would be how this simplifies.